Hello, good morning, everybody. We'll get started in just a bit here as we have more people join in. No, Michelle, remember all Thursday, all Friday, I was out of town. And I mentioned before that those would be the only 2 days that we would not have a live lecture. And because Friday in particular is a shortened day, I wouldn't have had a whole lot of time for lecture anyway. And so I simply assigned a reading assignment that utilized the same technique that we used when we read the Petrarch excerpt at the end of class on Wednesday of last week. And all you were to do is read the piece from Castiglione and use the Hippo template. And I made sure to explain everything that Hippo stands for and how it's used right in the assignment there. And you just basically read the document and fill in the info for each letter that you get from reading the document. So that was the only assignment for Friday. No problem. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. So we have about 11 people in here, and I am going to go ahead and get started as it is 7:40. So beginning with what we're going to be talking about today, and just a little bit of a reminder of where we left off last week. The last thing that we did while we met online last week was we went over a piece of humanist literature by Petrarch, who is often considered the father of humanism. And we say that the Renaissance more or less began right about the same time that Petrarch and his good friend Boccaccio die, and that's in the late 1300s, the late Middle Ages. Now, of course, the Renaissance doesn't just happen overnight, and no one knew necessarily that this was going to happen by any stretch of the imagination. So the Renaissance is not just like it's not like, for example, like the day that Abraham Lincoln got assassinated, right? That's like a specific date. We look back, we commemorate that date. It's not like that. It's not like a birthday or something either. It's more of like a period, a transitional period. And even within the Renaissance itself goes through a degree of evolution where the art styles continue to develop and change. And so humanism is one major feature of the Renaissance. And I think we should just take some time to remind ourselves what humanism really is. So one thing that gets a little bit confusing when you start to learn about humanism in the Renaissance is because when we talk about humanism today, most often when people use that word humanism, they're referring to a secular humanism, a humanism that values humans for the sake of humanity, right? That's like secular humanism, saying that like the reason that it's worthwhile to study humans is because humans are important and humanity is important, and we want to understand how human cultures relate around the world to one another and can better function or something along those lines. When we talk about classical humanism, though, which is the kind of humanism that's most associated with guys like Petrarch and Boccaccio and Pico della Mirandola and a number of others, classical humanism is actually, believe it or not, less secular and more religious than you might think it is. So what makes humanism of this time religious? Well, you have to understand the reasoning behind why they're studying the humans in the first place. And I mentioned this a little bit while I was talking about the letter that Petrarch wrote to Boccaccio when we were going over that text last week. And I mentioned to you that Petrarch was himself very, very, very devoutly Christian, just like essentially everyone in Europe at this time was devoutly Christian. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't some pagans or some people who, were like, whatever, dealt in witchcraft or something like that. I mean, I'm sure they existed, but the vast majority of people in Europe, the Roman Catholic Church very much defines their entire orientation of reality. As such, and this being the case, the humanists of this time were studying humans based on the merit of being the most divine, perfect creation of God. Okay, so the idea being that the Bible taught folks that God created humans in his image, and because God is perfect, that means that when God created humans, he was aiming to make them perfect. And so the humanists of the Renaissance are looking at humans from the perspective of them being a divine creation, and in fact, some of these humanists elevate the position of humans above other, even greater, typically viewed as greater celestial beings, like angels or saints, or maybe not like God or the Holy Spirit or whatever, but these humanists elevated the position. Remember that people in this time, in the late Middle Ages, in all segments of society across Europe, whether we're talking about religious, whether we're talking about cultural or economic or what have you, there is a rigid hierarchy, right? There's a very rigid hierarchy where everything has a known orderly place in the universe. So a peasant has his place on the rungs, just like a plant has its place, a dog has its place. And then, if you go all the way up to the upper echelons of society with, dukes and earls and all of the noble figures, then you get to like regal figures. in the Roman Catholic Church, there's an entire hierarchy of the church. Everything is ranked in society to a known, unchanging order, being of things. And one of the things that these humanists begin to do as they emphasize humans as a valid area of study based on the belief that humans are this divine creation is that they elevate the position, the traditionally held belief of the position of humanity to higher up on the celestial scale, saying that a human that becomes literate and becomes well-versed in poetry, a human that indulges all of those features that make humans amazing as bestowed to humans by God, those people elevate themselves above angels and saints. Not all humans do. Humans have the unique capacity to be able to choose to be slovenly or lazy or given into their sinful proclivities, whether it be any of the 7 deadly sins of vanity or lust or gluttony or pride or any of these sins. Humans can give themselves into sin and kind of lower themselves to being more like animals on this scale, or humans can indulge a love of learning and all of the features that make humans these amazing creatures, and they can elevate themselves to the level of the gods themselves. God, if you will, incarnate in the form of a human. And so when we see the art and the literature and sculptures of this time, there is a renewed emphasis on placing this perfectionism into the subject. So when you see Venus de Milo, or when you see Michelangelo's David, or when you see Mona Lisa in her painting, they are portrayed more perfectly, more proportionally, more symmetrically than they ever would have naturally been in real life. Take me, for example. I've got kind of a crooked face, and like my face, if you were to draw a straight line down the middle of it, and then like mirror the other side, it wouldn't look right because my face is kind of crooked. And so like, it's just, some people, it's, that's just how it is. Some people have more symmetrical faces, some people have less symmetrical faces. And in Renaissance art, they're trying to portray humans as these perfect beings, these divine beings that have the capability, not the guarantee, but the capability to distinguish themselves and live among the gods, that is, God reborn as man. Okay, so that's the emphasis of humanism, but I wanted to make sure that you understand that it is principally a religious movement and not a secular one. What we think of as secular humanism doesn't really come out until maybe a couple hundred years later at the earliest, with the Enlightenment maybe, but generally speaking, it's a much more modern phenomenon when we think about secular, non-religious humanism. Okay, so that kind of explains that principle. Now, of course, secularism, that is a nice segue, because secularism, happens to be the second major feature that we use to describe why the Renaissance was a major change from the late Middle Ages. So what is secularism? It just means non-religious, really. Okay, so when we talk about, secular society, we're just talking about society that is not having to do with the church. And that could be all sorts of things. So for example, the school is secular, right? Because we don't go to a private school. Religion is not taught as a course in the school. There is no doctrine that is placed upon you at a public high school. So public high schools are considered secular institutions, as are all governmental institutions in the United States. Now, of course, I understand that, like, for example, on money, you find things like "In God We Trust," or in the Pledge of Allegiance, pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, right? Keep in mind that those phrases actually weren't added until much, much later, the mid-50s. There was a huge conservative movement that happened in the 1950s, and so that portion under God put into the Pledge of Allegiance, I think happens around 1956. In God we trust on currency, same time. So those are pretty recent developments, but going back to the start of the country, frankly, the founding fathers probably wouldn't have been too big on having in God we trust on the currency, mostly because they weren't really of a particular religious background. They were kind of known as deists, a number of them. We'll get to this when we get to the Enlightenment. But suffice it to say, governmental institutions aren't supposed to be religious institutions. We're supposed to have a guaranteed separation between church and state. So, but then when we talk about secular when it comes to the Renaissance, remember that this is not just an on-off switch. It's not that people are either religious or they're secular and there's no in between. You can still be religious and be interested in non-religious things. Okay, it's not just a dichotomous situation where you're either one or the other. So keep in mind that these figures from the Renaissance that we're going to be discussing, the various artists and architects and so on, literary figures, they are really very religious. They live within the construct of their time, which to them, there's no separating people of that time from the Roman Catholic Church. It's too omnipotent. It's too omnipresent. Okay, it's everywhere. The Catholic Church is an inescapable reality for these people. It's part of the historical discourse in which they operate. So there's no such thing as somebody from that time really not being religious, because the only thing that there really was religious. It's uncommon to find people who were open about not being religious, because if you were open about not being religious in that time, you would have, essentially exiled yourself from your own community. So even people who weren't particularly religious in their heart may have acted religious just for the sake of getting along in society. That said, there is nonetheless a renewed interest in non-religious things. And that includes ancient stories from Rome and Greece, right? Where they're starting to look back at this ancient civilization that's been long gone for over 1,000 years by this point, and uncover ancient teachings, ancient learnings, ancient knowledge about this magnificent empire that the Romans built across Europe, that had largely been more or less forgotten, destroyed, covered up, crumbled away, and was nothing but ruins for going on a millennium. So anyhow, that's kind of like what we can say about secularism. It's not that people just abandon religion and then start only focusing on non-religious things. That's not how it happens. But what we do see in Europe over time, and indeed across the world, is as time goes on and we move farther and farther and farther away from kind of the ancient Judeo-Christian traditions, and when they took place 2,000 years ago, there has been a steady shift throughout time, particularly the focus of time in this class of the 1400s all the way up until modern day, where today church attendance is very low in Europe. Much of Europe is very non-religious. They're not particularly pious folks. America is by far and away the most religious Western country on the planet, and so religion has stuck around as part of the American identity, and is much more ingrained in American culture than in a lot of places in Europe. Not all places. For the further you go in Europe east, the more likely you are to run into more religious folks. But generally speaking, across the board in Europe, secularism is something that continues to grow, starting with the Renaissance and then moving all the way through until modern day. Okay, I'm going to go back now to the PowerPoint on the Renaissance, renaissancefinal.pdf. We are Coming towards the end of this unit here, as I said, we'll be testing on this in a week. So we're going to finish this up and talk about a few other things. So I am on slide 6 out of 97. And this one starts off, unlike Northern Europe, Italian cities remain free to expand rather than dominated by kings or princes. And we see 5 major city-states emerge in what is now known as a unified Italian nation state. But remember, that's a relatively recent phenomena. The Italian city-states remained very competitive with one another, oftentimes even allying with foreign nations like France or Spain against one another. And so there was not really a sense of Italian unity or an Italian nation at this time. Rather, people would have looked at themselves on a more regional basis. I am from Milan, I am from Florence, I am Venetian, I'm from Venice, okay, or, you know, from Naples, Napoli. So, they're not unified at this time, is what I'm trying to say here, and they're competitive, and also they do a lot of trade on the Mediterranean, and they're competitive from an economic spirit as well as a political or cultural one. And you can see on the next slide, on slide 7 out of 97, how the states are divided up there. You have the Duchy of Milan a little bit further north and inland, Genoa, Florence is in green there. The Republic of Venice is in gray. That's the one with the, if you've ever seen the images of the city with a bunch of, well, there's more than one city with canals in it, but the famous Italian gondolas where you have guys in like striped shirts, or if you've ever been to Las Vegas and seen the Venetian hotel and casino, it's based on the city of Venice. And then Rome, or the Papal States, are, the Papal States is where Rome resides. And then the Kingdom of Naples, which is in southern Italy, which remained largely agricultural. Most of the better trading ports were further north at the end of the Adriatic Sea, like Venice, or up at the top northern portion of the Mediterranean Sea, just north of Corsica, which at the time was part of Genoa. As we move further into this PowerPoint, slide 8 says, intense social strife, the poor suffered greatly. There was huge competition for political power. And we have, a structured society where you have kind of like the old rich, the grandi, and then you got the new rich, which was the popolo grosso. You got to say it with the Italian accent, right? The burghers, which were like small business owners, like almost think like Pittsburgh. That's where we get that burger. Okay. Burg is a German and French word to describe a urban center of some sort. And popolo minuto was the poor folks. And we see a number of different conflicts as a result of poor folks rioting and causing uprisings, feuding between old rich and new rich as well. A collapse of the banking system left a lot of poor folks vulnerable, but the stability of Florence in particular returns under a new leader by the name of Cosmo de Medici. All right, Cosmo de Medici was this banker and statesman. And the Medici family became very, very well known in Florence for establishing this merchant banking service. They became extremely wealthy from it. They held, consequential positions in government that were very, very important for the flourishing of art and culture, and that renewed emphasis on antiquity comes from the Medici family, who commissioned a lot of the art of this time. We have a word for that. It's called patronage. So if you're a patron of the arts, what that essentially means is that you are a donor, or you somehow contribute by way of paying to commission pieces to be made, or paying for ancient artifacts like Roman or Greek statues and other things like that. Okay, so at this time, despotism. Despots were hired by many city-states to keep order, usually with mercenary armies which were obtained through military brokers called condottieri. The condottieri are just these brokers who would help to hire, they try and get you hired hands to help you keep your power. They're paid mercenaries, paid soldiers, essentially. And there's this huge profusion of wealth as a result of the Medici banking, merchant banking business that develops in Florence, where the birthplace of the Renaissance is. And they controlled the city behind the scenes with these very powerful guilds that were loyal to the Medicis, and the Medicis kind of had some muscle behind them. And so it's kind of almost, it's very oligarchical in nature. You have a couple of extraordinarily wealthy families who retain significant influence, political influence, as a product of their wealth. So it's very oligarchical in Italy at this time. They're almost kind of like, I hate to say this, but they're almost kind of like mob families, except for they're not involved in like illicit crimes and stuff like that. Although usury, which is borrowing money and then, or like say a bank lending money, and so you borrow it from the bank and then pay back interest, usury was at one point considered a sin, and it was a moral taboo. But by the time that we get to this time, that's kind of out the window. So the grandson of Cosmo de Medici was Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was also of the Medici family, but he was a totalitarian ruler who controlled Florence from 1478 to 1492. And this is right about the time that Leonardo da Vinci is around. Some of the most famous pieces of the early to high Renaissance period came under Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was paying a whole lot of money to have these pieces commissioned. And then, of course, shortly thereafter, the Roman Catholic Church kind of realized this revitalization of art, that you had these new masters that were coming out of Florence and this academy in Florence, and they began to, the Roman Catholic Church began to commission pieces as well from these famous artists like Raphael and some of the other artists that you've probably heard of from this era. Moving on to the next slide, slide 10 out of 97. Florentine women spinning and doing needlework here. These activities took up much of a woman's time in this day and age, and contributed to the elegance of the dress for which Florentine men and women were famed. And of course, this would have been the dress of the upper class, probably not just your average peasant. To live in the city would have required that you made some degree of money anyway, because space in the city is, there's a lot of demand for space in the city, right? Because the more people are in an area, the more people are, trying to use that area. The area becomes a commodity, and the value of that area goes up. So to live in the city would have required that you had some degree of wealth. And there's some poorer merchants and there's some wealthier merchants, but the Florentine clothing that they wore was typically very, very nice. And moving on to the next slide, slide 11, you can see here kind of the example that I was trying to demonstrate about the idea of human perfectibility. That is, that humans are perfectly symmetrical, that they are perfectly proportioned. And this piece here, which is known as the Vitruvian Man, Vitruvian Man by Leonardo, it's just a sketch by Leonardo da Vinci, is supposed to put man inside both a square and circle. The idea being that once again there's a mathematical genius, a divine perfectibility to man, and again the perfect symmetry and so on and so forth, demonstrating that. So the scholarly study of Greek and Latin classics and the ancient church fathers in hopes of reviving worthy ancient values is known as humanism. Okay, so they're trying to uncover these ancient values of the pinnacle of human achievements. And that came in art and architecture and so on, as well as their governmental systems and things. And so the Renaissance educated elite advocated for studia humanitatis, which is the liberal arts study. Now, of course, in modern days, you can still go to a college and get a liberal arts education, which is pretty much anyone who graduates with a bachelor's degree has some kind of liberal arts education. That is to say that when you get your bachelor's, it's not just only you've not just only taken history classes. That will be the majority of your course study. For somebody who, like myself, was a history major, I took a lot more history classes than other classes. But in order to graduate, I was still nonetheless required to take other classes to make sure that I was proficient enough in other areas as well, such as math and science, and more or less have my head wrapped around the basics, but have a specialty in a particular field, and that's what we call your major. Well, so we still offer this today. Most people who have a bachelor's degree have some sort of liberal arts education. That's not always the case. There are exceptions to that. But generally speaking, most people are required to take a number of what they call general education courses to kind of round their degree out and make sure that they're kind of a jack of all trades of sorts. Even though you may not be great at math, you've at least been exposed to college level algebra and things. Okay, so liberal arts study. Italian humanists searched out manuscript collections, ancient texts, making volumes of Greek and Latin learning available to other scholars, compendiums of knowledge and things of that nature. Moving on to slide 12, talking about some of these humanists. We already took a look at Petrarch, father of humanism, celebrated ancient Rome. He himself wrote these sonnets, these love sonnets, these epic poems, but also was a master of ancient poetry, and had also written biographies of various Roman emperors. He wasn't a fan of the previous generalized school that people were formalized in the late Middle Ages, which was scholasticism. Scholasticism was kind of, it was more of an emphasis on the teachings of the Bible, where people would ask a lot of like rhetorical kinds of questions surrounding debates in the Bible. Scholasticism was a very religious-oriented education, but it was very theologian in nature. It was very what's the word that I'm looking for? It was theological in nature. And these scholasticists would more or less be using the Bible as a text and having what's the word that I'm looking for? Rhetoric debates surrounding the language in the Bible. So that's kind of what scholasticism was all about. And Petrarch felt like scholasticism was kind of like the never-ending revolving door. You could just walk in circles and circles and circles and not come up with any finite conclusions on a particular issue with the Bible. So he much more advocated for the school of humanism. And you can still study the humanities today, of course. So craved return to classics of ancient Rome. Both religious and secular ideas came from Petrarch, and he is oftentimes compared to Dante. Dante Alighieri was the writer of the Divine Comedy, and you've probably heard of the 7 deadly sins and so on and so forth. Okay, and that is who is on the next slide. So the Divine Comedy written in the vernacular. The real significance here is that for the first time ever, keep in mind most people at this day and age are illiterate, particularly the lower classes, but most people are in the lower class, which stands to reason that most people would also be illiterate. But even people in the upper classes may not necessarily be particularly literate or very, very well read. And so one of the reasons for that is because there's not a lot to read outside of the Bible during the late Middle Ages. It's really not until we get to the Renaissance where we begin to see more individually written works, being that the Bible is, of course, collectively written by a number of different people. But you start to see like individual works come out by individual authors, and you see individual art pieces come out by individual painters or sculptors or what have you. And this is a focus of individualism. Well, one of the things that increased literacy during this time is that for authors, they began writing in what became known as the vernacular, the local language of the particular place that they're from. So Dante was Italian. By that point in Italy, no one spoke Latin anymore. And although there are some similarities between Latin and Italian. Truth be told, they're really not the same language at all. And so, people didn't read Latin anymore, but pretty much everything that people had access to read was written in Latin, particularly religious texts and so on. And so when we start to see new writings become available that are written in a language that people actually spoke in, it became easier for them to begin to become literate because there became more materials available for them to learn how to read in the language that they spoke already. So that is a significant thing. And we also see translations of the Bible into local vernaculars as well. Moving forward to the next one, I'm now on slide 14. Giovanni Boccaccio, he was Petrarch's student and friend. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, which was 100 tales, which could be funny or bawdy about sexual or economic misconduct of his day. And he kind of took a sympathetic look at human behavior and made fun of, almost poked fun of, the fact that humans have the ability to make fools of themselves, but nonetheless, that was kind of what made humans great. Maybe a little bit too sympathetic look at humans, but anyway, he also assembled an encyclopedia of Greek and Roman mythology, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so education goals and reforms of the humanists, there was like this emphasis placed on the mastery of ancient languages and to challenge recent religious traditions, and also innovation, discovery of new sources, coming up with new ideas or new takes on old ideas. That's kind of what innovation is, right? It's not an invention. It's not necessarily creative, but innovation is like taking something that's already there and finding new perspectives, finding new understandings on it. And they assembled huge collections of manuscripts, critiqued the ills of contemporary society. And the real goal of the humanist education in Florence and around the rest of the Italian Renaissance was wisdom eloquently spoken, knowledge of what is good, virtue, as it's sometimes put, and ability to make others desire to do good as well. All right. The idea that learning ennobles people, the idea that by learning, you are becoming not only nobler of mind, but nobler of spirit. That when you become educated, you live a nobler life where you understand the ills of society, you attempt to avoid those ills, and you try to lift the spirits of those around you to encourage them to live an educated life as well. And this kind of relates to what your assignment was on Friday, reading about the courtier, which was by Castiglione. Now, Castiglione wrote the courtier with the idea of laying out kind of the guidelines for all of what he viewed to be the essential assets of a noble member of the court, a courtier, who was like a lesser noble in the king's court, usually some kind of like a gentlemanly figure. And they would dress nice, but they were typically kind of sycophantic, meaning that they were brown nosers, right? Sycophantic. They would kiss up to the king. They would try and gain the king's favor, all right? And of course, improve their lot in life around the king's court. So the idea of a Renaissance man is that a courtier was supposed to be educated in a number of different things, to possess this liberal arts education, to engage in reading, writing, music, poetry, religion, okay? Remember, a good courtier was also pious, okay? But also that of arms, to be brave in the face of combat, to have courage, again, kind of this ancient values of the ancient Roman and Greek empires of like bravery and service and honor and justice, and being a good warrior, but also being not like a dumb brute, but an educated man of arms, right? This was the idea that Castiglione is talking about in the courtier, which I think probably came through as you were reading it. And if you haven't yet submitted that Hippo assignment, please don't forget to do that. Literally, all you have to do is just read the post that I put up on Canvas, and it explains what every letter stands for, and you basically just fill in the information for each letter on the document for the Courtier by Castiglione. So what was the historical context, who was the intended audience, and so on and so on. And you're just trying to read that document with a new discerning eye, where you're not just passively reading the document, but you're reading against the grain, you're questioning what you're reading and trying to make sense of it. You're trying to put it into the broader framework of everything that we're learning about in this class. Okay, so moving forward here, I'm going to jump forward to slide 17, and you're going to see here a Renaissance garden. This piece here is a pretty classical example of what late Middle Ages art looked like. Now, it's exaggerated in some ways, okay, but take a look at how proportion is used in this piece. Okay, this is a late Middle Ages piece. You have these two gentlemen standing there. Between them, you can tell somewhere in the distance, people are smaller, and they're kind of placed awkwardly between these two guys that are standing in the forefront of the picture. As you look at the path doesn't really follow a predictable linear perspective. The path kind of winds down and into the background, and there is some depth here. It's not that it doesn't have any depth, okay? There is depth conveyed in this, but it's not a particularly precise use of depth. And then two, you've got those guys who are like, they've climbed the trees, I guess, for some reason. But again, the trees themselves don't look like they're big enough, or those two guys look like they're too big for the trees. It just looks really awkward and not right. And so that's a classical example of one of the features of how art changed over time, right? Was that the perspective and the use of space on a flat two-dimensional surface to convey three-dimensional depth became far more sophisticated in the Renaissance, and sometimes even using like two vanishing points and having depth going in multiple directions and so on, as they did the perspective for the piece and the outlining of the piece that they were creating. So, and then two, the faces on the figures seem kind of flat. There's not a whole lot of emotional expression. And that's another major feature of Renaissance art, particularly when we get to the high Renaissance. There's a lot more emotional conveyance, expressiveness from the faces of the subjects. And so that's another major feature, if it feels like there's some sort of emotion being conveyed by the piece, rather than just like a flat piece where somebody just seemingly is kind of like stone-faced. That's another major feature of Renaissance art as well. Okay, let's see here. Christine de Pizan treasured the city of ladies. There's mention of that in the book. Christine de Pizan, a woman of her time, believed that, I'm just going to really briefly mention, Christine de Pizan felt that a woman's job was to serve her husband. And so we need to be clear that while she's an important figure in suggesting that women should get an education, she's also a very traditional figure of her time, which is that the reason that a woman would want to get an education is because she could then serve her husband, who was the boss of the affairs, of the business, of the whatever in the household, and be a better server to guests, she was really looking to improve women's education so as to become better servants of their husbands. So we can't really call Christine de Pizan some sort of modern day feminist. Remember that really the feminist movement, calling anyone from history a feminist that came before about the year 1955 or so, is kind of like using a term not in the right place in time. There really isn't a feminist movement prior to the end of World War II. We only see feminism emerge after the end of World War II in 1945. So just keep that in mind. She's an important female figure, but she is herself not an actual feminist like Simone de Beauvoir or someone like that. All right. Greek and the Platonic Revival and Florentine Academy. You can go to the Florentine Academy today. That's where Michelangelo's David is. And it's not really a former school, but it's a gathering of very influential Florentine humanists who were devoted to reviving the ancient teachings of Plato, the Greek philosopher, and other Neoplatonists. And Platonism is just a flattering view of human reason as part of the ideal or eternal world versus the kind of real perishable world, and this notion of human freedom to make decisions. And again, like the brilliance of, it's really putting an emphasis on the perfectibility of human reason and how incredible of an ability to be able to use reason in the capacity that humans are able, as opposed to say like apes or something like that. Apes might be able to use simple reason to solve a puzzle or something like that, and they may indeed be very intelligent, but they're not going to be able to have a conversation with you about, esoteric qualities of, politics or something like that. And so humanist critical scholarship, Lorenzo Valla exposed the donation of Constantine as fake. And so they're starting to take and critique works, which is what all good academics do. They don't just passively read, they critique what they're reading. And that's some of the skills, the very same skills that I'm trying to teach you in this class here. Civic humanism was the belief that education should promote goodness and public service. And later they became kind of cliquish snobs. They actually end up getting criticized by a famous political figure that we're going to be talking about soon named Machiavelli. And Niccolo Machiavelli was this very famous author. He wrote something called The Prince. We will take a look at some excerpts of that later. But this kind of exposes the two sides of humanism. The one side being that humans have this ability, these amazing abilities to use reason and achieve human perfectibility and improve their status, not only in an earthly way, but in a divine way, and that sort of thing. But also the other darker side of humanism, which is that it kind of creates this elitist snob, these people who are really very deep scholars, but kind of like they're living up in the stratosphere and they're not really connected to Earth anymore because they're so philosophical. They're kind of ignoring the problems immediately in front of their noses. And so practical solutions to things really never became accomplished because these elitist educated folks kind of started not really approaching the problems Italy was facing with pragmatic solutions, but instead very lofty ones that most people didn't understand. So talking about the next guy we're going to be looking at, and I'm going to be putting up a document of, we're going to do another Hippo assignment today to get some more practice with that in advance in preparation for the test. And so give you a little bit of background on this next one that we're going to be looking at is from a guy, a humanist author by the name of Pico della Mirandola. And he wrote something called Oration on the Dignity of Man. Now, an oration is simply a speech, okay? But Oration on the Dignity of Man, and he wrote this in 1486. And this was supposed to be the introduction to a collection of 900 different theses. And the oration, the goal of his Oration on the Dignity of Man was Mirandola was trying to depict humans as the only creatures in the world who possess the freedom to be whatever they chose to be. That is, they could rise to the height of angels, or they could wallow and stoop themselves to the depth of pigs wallowing in mud or something like that. So that is the kind of background a little bit on Pico della Mirandola. And right now what I'm going to have you do is go to the files section on Canvas. Okay, go to the file section on Canvas. And I am right now uploading the document. Okay, Mirandola. All right, so that should be up there. It's called O5 Mirandola Excerpts. It's a doc file. And I'm just going to read for you as you get that pulled up here. I'm just going to read, and you can listen along the top portion. I'm not going to read the text for you this time because I'm trying to give you guys some opportunities to practice reading some of these things on your own and start implementing both the Persia and the Hippo techniques, reading analysis techniques that we've been learning about. So, but I will read the intro. It says, if there is such a thing as a manifesto of the Italian Renaissance, Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man is it. No other work more forcefully, eloquently, or thoroughly remaps the human landscape to center all attention on human capacity and the human perspective. Pico himself had a massive intellect and literally studied everything there was to be studied in the university curriculum of the Renaissance. The Oration is in part meant to be a preface to a massive compendium of all of the intellectual achievements of humanity, a compendium that never appeared because of Pico's early death. So Pico was a humanist, following a way of thinking that originated as far back as the 14th century, the 1300s. Late medieval and Renaissance humanism was a response to the dry concerns for logic and linguistics that animated the other great late medieval Christian philosophy, scholasticism, which we talked about earlier in today's lecture. The humanists, rather than focusing on what they considered futile questions of logic and semantics, focused on the relation of the human to the divine. Okay, so I want you to think about that line for a second. Focusing on the relationship of the human to the divine, okay? Because you're going to read a lot about that coming up in this piece here. And even when we talked about Petrarch's piece, the last class, the relationship between humans and divinity is something that is being critiqued by the humanists. It's being reimagined, okay? So think about that. Seeing in human beings the summit and purpose of God's creation. Their concern was to define the human place in God's plan and the relation of the human to the divine. Therefore, they centered all their thought on the human relation to the divine and hence called themselves humanists. At no point do they ignore their religion. Humanism, as we're talking about it in this class, is first and foremost a religious movement, not a secular one. Okay, so what we call secular humanism in modern political discourse is a worldview that arises in part from humanism, but is nevertheless conceived in opposition to classical humanism, which is very religiously oriented. It's about defining this connection between divinity and humans, focusing on the human relationship to the divine, i.e. humanism. Okay, so here's what I'm going to have you do. Now, I am going to tell you that on the the Canvas file section, the Hippo template is still there. So you can download and save a new copy of that, okay, onto your desktop, other than the one that you used to do the Castiglione piece on the Courtier last Friday. You can download a new one. And so your assignment for today, which I am essentially going to be giving you the last, 30 minutes here roughly? Yeah, so we got about a half hour left of class. So what I'm going to have you guys do is in this last half hour, you're going to open up a new Hippo template. You're going to read the Mirandola excerpt that I gave you and try to do your best to answer, once again, the historical context, the intended audience. Who is this being written for? The purpose. What was the purpose of the document? And that's probably the one that you're going to want to think about a lot, in particular as it relates to humanism. And then point of view. And then finally, outside information. How could we connect this to maybe something else that we've read in the last week or so? So if there aren't any questions, I'm going to hop back over here. I don't see any questions on the little thing here. I will be creating the assignment so that you'll have a way of submitting it on Canvas. I have a busy day ahead of me. I'm going to be using my time here while you're working on this to try and update grades and get everything that I can into the grade book. And by the time that I leave today, pretty much everything that's been handed into me will be updated and put into queue. As I said, thank you again for your patience as I was out of town at my sister's wedding, which went really, really nicely. Very, very beautiful ceremony. It was great to see my whole family and spend time with them. But today it's time to get back to business. And so I'm going to be updating Q today with everything that has been submitted to me. If you're still missing work after today, remember there's always two dates. There's the due date, and then there's the close date of the assignment, the available until date. And if you miss the available until date, then it goes in as a 0. But if you have assignments that you have not yet completed and they are still open, you may do them for late credit. And that is 80% credit. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to do one last thing before you sign off, and that is I would like you to tell me, boy, what's a good one for today? What is your favorite movie of all time? What is your favorite movie of all time? And this is how I'm taking attendance, so you please do respond to this. But what is your favorite movie of all time? Legend of Pi, that's a good one. X-Men, Pitch Perfect, that was a good movie. I like Pitch Perfect. Camp Rock, Polar Express, that's a good one. That's a Christmas movie. Fast and the Furious, Titanic, Up, that's a good one. Knives Out. Wow, you guys have seen Knives Out? That's a pretty good movie. I just watched that like a few months ago with my mom. Mulan, great movie. I was in 8th grade when Mulan came out. Matilda. Wow, you guys are big Knives Out fans in here. That was a good movie, I will admit. Very clever movie. Bambi, Boss Baby. I've never seen that one. Any others? Is that everybody already? Is that? Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Big Friendly Giant. I was like, I don't know what BFG is. Maybe I really shouldn't ask. You're always getting yourself, when you're old like me and you are not hip to what kids are saying anymore, you're always really taking a risk asking what something means. So, oh, thanks. No problem, Natalia. Thank you for that. So anyhow, folks, all right. Very good. Well, thank you so much for tuning in today. Seriously, it's great to hear from you all. I hope that you're doing you're doing well and that you're happy and healthy. Where do we answer the questions from Mirandola? You can just type it right onto that Hippo template, like that page on the files thing that says Hippo template. You can literally just type it into that, and then I'll put this. I haven't put the submission thing up yet, but I'm going to do that right now, Victor. So don't worry, that'll be up in just a few minutes. All right, guys. Any other questions for me before we sign off here? You got it. All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday. Bye-bye now.